All right. Yes. I'm going to talk a little bit about judgment, and thinking, and the relationship between judgment and thinking. In response to the controversy, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the controversy that was sparked by the book rather than Eichmann and Jerusalem itself. In response to the controversy that was sparked by Arendt's assessment of Eichmann as banal, or as she puts it, neither monstrous nor demonic, but simply demonstrating an inability to think. Arendt argues that we certainly can and we must be willing to make difficult judgments in our role as citizens. We should judge as spectators or be able to make judgments concerning events or occurrences at which we were not present, and as actors, even under the worst conditions such as those faced under totalitarianism. And in holding those who were German citizens and even Jewish victims responsible for their actions under totalitarian rule, as well as judging these events after the fact, Arendt argues that there's a personal responsibility to think and to judge, both when one is part of a moment in history and inside a culture, or as I'll be calling it, from the inside, and that there's a responsibility for spectators to judge after the fact and to hold individuals accountable for these actions, or to judge from the outside. And this is what she says in response to many of the criticisms of her account of Eichmann in Jerusalem. So while it's clear that there's often a reluctance to judge even from the outside, and Arendt notes this phenomenon is crystallized by the question, who am I to judge since I wasn't there? In the brief comments I'm going to make today, I want to focus on the difficulty of judging from the inside, or from Eichmann's position inside one's culture and one's historical moment. Eichmann as a person, in his banality, demonstrated the inability to think, and hence to judge, during what Arendt calls dark times. And dark times, as Roger Berkowitz said earlier and says in his essay, clarifies that dark times are not times which are literally shrouded in darkness, but rather times in which we as citizens often fail to see facts that are hidden in plain sight. We cannot see the all too public invisibility of inconvenient facts, in spite of all the talk about them, due in part to a bombardment of cliches or reasoned arguments regarding such facts, and that's what Roger focuses on in his essays. Both cliches and what passes as reasoned argument discourage actual thinking, which for Arendt is a specific mental activity where one stops to consider whether one could live with oneself after participating in whatever sort of activity, such as torture, violence, even genocide, that's being argued for in the name of reason or talked about in terms of cliches, such as patriotic, nationalist, any kind of legitimating cliches. When unjustifiable types of political events occur, whether they happen in the moment of crisis or over a long period of oppression or systemic violence, it's often easier to see the injustice or feel the outrage after the fact or from a position outside the culture or moment in history. So it doesn't, to me, seem terribly controversial to say that judgment from the position of the spectator or from a position outside of one's location inside the culture or the moment in history seems to be an easier or maybe just a more possible activity than judgment on the part of the actor inside one's moments of history, inside one's culture. Inside one's culture and one's moment in history, we're often blind to the evils around us, in part because of this bombardment of cliches, in part because of reasoned arguments, etc., etc. And we're sometimes willfully blind, sometimes passively blind, right? In other words, we easily become banal, or as what Arendt talks about Eichmann as banal, we mean no harm necessarily, there isn't an intention. In fact, Arendt says that Eichmann's conscience rebelled at the idea of cruelty, not at the idea of murder. And I think that's really important for our argument. But yet we participate in evil, and sometimes even in extreme evil, by our inability to think. So I just want to quickly linger over two questions. How can we encourage, and this is just sort of riffing off Arendt, how can we encourage and make possible the conditions for judgment inside one's culture? And this is the question that I'd like to spend a little more time on, but I really can't, is thinking, as Arendt defines it, the best possible guard against evildoing on the part of the banal actor? So is thinking really the way to go? So I want to recount an intellectual personal anecdote to illustrate the complexities of these questions for our own times. In October 2002, over a year following the September 11 attacks, I traveled to Barcelona to participate in an international feminist conference on the political repression of women around the globe. Nawal al-Saadawi, the Egyptian novelist, physician, and activist, was the keynote speaker. An outspoken critic of the Western-oriented Egyptian governments of Sadat and Mubarak, as well as Islamic religious fundamentalists, Saadawi has acquired a lot of enemies on all parts of the political spectrum. She was imprisoned under Sadat in 1981 for objecting to the Jerusalem Peace Treaty, and 10 years later, after her name appeared on an Islamist death list, she had to leave Egypt for 5 years in order to avoid that fatwa. Saadawi occupies a critical relationship, obviously, to her own culture, and she argues that the pro-Western governments of Sadat and Mubarak, supported by the United States, encouraged the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt and elsewhere as a way to fight more leftist, progressive challenges to neoliberalism and state repression. Yet, when Saadawi was asked at this conference by the International Feminist audience to speak about the topic of Mubarak's jailing of intellectual and political dissidents, which was occurring at the time and occurring pretty regularly, she responded to us by telling us that criticisms of the Egyptian government by Western intellectuals were not very useful, and certainly not very useful to Egyptian political dissidents, not as useful to Egyptian political dissidents as criticisms of our own government and the West's political dominance. So critical judgment of our own U.S. and European governments' priorities would be, for her, she said, the best way to demonstrate solidarity with third world dissidents. So on the one hand, this seems obvious, right? Criticisms of the U.S. government's support of Mubarak on the part of U.S. citizens could, were it successful, lead directly to less money to prop up Mubarak's repressive government and open up multiple political possibilities inside of Egypt. But Saadawi, I think, was demanding much more of us than this, because her keynote address centered around a critique of Derrida for joining Habermas and calling for a renewed commitment to the values of the European public sphere and old Europe, and the values of old Europe and international law in the wake of the September 11th attacks and the increasing U.S. threats against Iraq. And then in an essay authored later, so Derrida and Habermas were making their rounds around Europe calling for this, and then they published an article later which was called February 15th, What Binds Europeans Together. This was right before the shock and awe campaign of March 2003, and Derrida and Habermas published this article right before, talking about the events of February 15th around the world and outrage about the impending U.S. campaign in Iraq. And in this essay, which was written by Habermas but endorsed by Derrida, the two argued that the only viable third path beyond U.S. imperialism and fundamentalist terror was to be found in the values of old Europe, emphasizing cosmopolitan world order based in international law. That's the gist of the article. According to Saadawi, and this is particularly what she was criticizing in her keynote address, to call for judgment from the position of the European public sphere displayed for her what she called a striking inability to forget Europe's imperial past, the neo-colonial and neoliberal policies that they were perpetrating, and completely dismissed all third world peoples by putting them in the category of those who would be judged than those who would judge themselves. Saadawi's lecture was a challenge then to European and U.S. feminists, asking us to criticize our own governments, while those in the third world would criticize theirs, before we could have a political conversation that would be honestly accountable to multiple perspectives. So though Saadawi might initially sound like she's making a kind of authentic insider argument about judgment, that one can only adequately speak to one's own culture and conditions, I think instead that she's gesturing to an argument that another political theorist, Linda Zarelli, has recently made, called rootedness, of the sort that can ground political engagement. When she asked participants of the conference to make critical judgments and critical demands upon their own Western governments before engaging in political conversations about non-Western governments and their citizens, she asked us to participate in a conversation about judgment in which each person, rooted in a critical position on their own context, and that's the hard work of judgment, right, is able to come to the conclusions after considering multiple standpoints. So, yet this can only happen if the hard work of attaining this critical purchase on one's own context is achieved, something that she just clearly didn't believe that Habermas and Derrida had attained in their call for a return to old Europe's values. So given the hard work of judging within one's own culture and the ways judgment is obscured by what passes as reasonable dialogue, I want to finally and briefly raise the question of whether the activity of thinking, as described by Arendt, as alone with one's conscious, can guard against the becoming the banal person who participates in evil, especially when that evil might not be as visible as the evil of the Holocaust. And this goes back to some of Laurie's concerns about the security state and so forth. Arendt herself, I just want us to remember, found it more difficult to see what's in plain sight around her than what was distant from her. Thinking from her own isolated position and asking from the position of enlarged mentality, something that I generally like, her concept in her book, but judging the position of enlarged mentality and saying, what would I do if I were a Negro mother? In her 1959 essay, Reflections on Little Rock, Arendt's answer, condoning American apartheid, should give us pause. And it should give us pause about this concept of thinking and how it's related to judgment. Maybe she should have engaged in political conversations with intellectuals such as Richard Wright or James Baldwin, who, from their own insider locations inside of Black America, had illuminated the specter of American evil and were speaking out about it constantly at the same moment. In 1962, James Baldwin also identified something akin to the banality of evil when he argued in The Fire Next Time that white Americans, possibly like Derrida and Habermas, white Europeans, were still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. Yet, this lack of understanding, though banal, or as Baldwin says, innocent, is guilty. It's not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It's the innocence which constitutes the crime. That's Baldwin. In short, to truly judge and to ward off evil, banality of evil as well as radical evil, we must hold ourselves accountable for our own culture and historical moment, to judge within our dark times, to be rooted in our own critical assessments of our culture, heeding St. Always call to judge ourselves so we can be open to the judgments that outsiders make of us, and likewise they can be open to our judgments. This is the first and most difficult responsibility of citizenship, but it can only occur with others within the political possibility of collective action rather than from the position of the isolated thinker. And that's my critique of the thinking. Sorry.